Just think about it. Just think about it. I used to hate coaches that said that. Of course I'm thinking about it. I can't avoid it with you blabbering on. They used to say things like, you need to get it in your head. Are you even listening? Just pay attention. No matter how hard I tried, I found my own solutions. Coaches didn't like it. I guess they just put up with it. But when I decided to do a coaching degree, I made a pact to myself. Don't be the coach you hated. It was hard. Giving instruction is far easier. Telling someone it is in their head and to just practice was an easy, how I see it now, get out. A get out of coaching. Skipping the long life story here, I realised those coaches had assumptions. No, they didn't necessarily know what they were. After all, most of my coaches weren't what I would now call effective coaches. When I was younger, I would use some choice words, but they were not familiar with coaching science. Yeah, I know, there is more than blowing a whistle and putting cones on the floor. Who would have guessed? But I don't blame them. Before I challenged it, I thought it was all in my head too. That's not to say this alternative view is right. I think it is, but it does ask some questions about coaching behaviour and helps me explain why I struggled so much with so many of my youth coaches, and teachers for that matter, and this also goes beyond sports coaching. But for the sake of time, I'm going to use Q as an example. Q is a basketball shooting and dribbling robot. It has been programmed to shoot hoops. The robot doesn't have a brain, like humans anyway, but it does process information to make a shot. This is the assumption my youth coaches made. I see things, I process things, then I act. Telling me to think about it was them talking about processing. You need to get it in your head. Again, it's referring to this motor action program stored in my brain. A memory, maybe? At school, I learnt about the Fitz-Posner model. Uni then poo-pooed it a bit, but it was what my youth coaches used to follow. Again, whether they knew about it or not, I don't know, but it does match the behaviours I saw remembering my experiences. The beginner is in the cognitive stage of learning, trying to find out what to do, doing lots of cognition, thinking, and processing of information. Then you move to the associative or intermediate stage of learning, trying to find out how to perform the skill. Thinking or processing now on different things like other players, so less thinking about your skill. Sometimes moving to the autonomous stage of learning, where, as you can guess, the skill is autonomous and you don't think about it much, if at all. A nice linear progression, stage 1, 2, 3, and maybe go back to learn something new and then forwards again. But that all relies on the assumption we store action programs in our head, and learning is making those programs, memories, because what we sense, what we see, what we feel, etc., isn't enough. There isn't enough information. We need our brain to process, to predict, to store things for us to act by getting it in our heads. Q definitely learns like this. The information is sensed, given to it by a person, and processed. Lots of calculations done by AI, resulting in an action motor program. It shoots. But what if the information was enough, and we don't do calculations in our head? Opens up a lot of questions. Most I'll talk about in future videos, but what if we directly perceive? We sense all the information we need, not needing processing, not storing it in our heads. Well, now the Fitz-Posner model has some issues. The main one, we are always in the cognitive stage, always learning what to do in this situation, in that situation. But I think linear learning is an obvious issue. Learning is an up, down, left, right, in, out, shake it all about ongoing experience. So why does direct perception matter? In the traditional approaches to perception, it's a step that happens in your brain because there isn't enough information when we sense. see things. We indirectly perceive. Use our brains to add context to the information. But direct perception says otherwise. All the information we need is in the environment with relation to the organism, person. So instead of the brain processing and adding context for perception, we perceive opportunities for behaviour in the context we are in, termed affordances. Like friction, an affordance relies on two things. Friction, two surfaces, rub them together and friction emerges. Affordances, organism and environment. Affordances will emerge with a conscious organism in an environment. If we assume the context is in our heads, we should be able to reproduce skills irrespective of the environment. But I think we all recognise that isn't quite true. When trying to explain this with the traditional approach of perception, it being indirect, I hit my head on the ceiling, as Julia said in our recent conversation, the author of the book I've been reading recently. I used to say things like, it's a different ball, it's a different place, it's not my day-to-day, but the emphasis is on the change in environment. If learning is the program in your brain, do you need a program for every imaginable situation? Maybe. Or we could say we directly perceive affordances in the environment, which means I don't need to get it in my head. Learning happens in the relationship between me and the environment. I focus on affordances I perceive. If there is too much information I am directly perceiving, then the coach can constrain the environment. That is the constraints-led approach to coaching, something I learnt a lot about at uni. I think direct perception matters because it takes learning out of a person's head and into the relationship between the entire person and environment. Memory isn't the problem. Brain capacities or limits aren't the problem. Intelligence isn't the problem. It is the relationship between the person and environment. The expertise a person has to attune or focus on affordances, being more sensitive to affordances, understanding their own constraints and adjusting accordingly. Everyone is different in constantly changing environments, so shouldn't learning explanations be able to explain that? I have my own thoughts, but this is what I'm learning about.